Who let this black kid into my classroom? Professor Richard Hartwell didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't need to. That's what tenure does for you. It gives you immunity, protection, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're untouchable. 23 years at one of America's most prestigious universities, a six-figure salary that didn't include his consulting fees or board memberships, completely and utterly untouchable. The words hung in the air of the lecture hall like poison. You back row, stand up. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in academic authority. No one in that massive auditorium expected the man sitting in the back row to speak. That was precisely the point. He had positioned himself there intentionally, deliberately choosing the spot where nobody important ever bothered to look. He wore a plain gray hoodie, no designer logo, no brand name, nothing that would draw attention, no expensive watch on his wrist, no jewelry, no presence whatsoever. Just another quiet student blending into the background, occupying space where the invisible people sat. But Professor Richard Hartwell looked anyway. Something about the young man bothered him. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was prejudice, maybe it was both. Who approved him for this class? Hartwell said, his voice remaining calm but sharp enough to cut through the murmuring conversations. The question echoed through the massive tiered lecture hall, bouncing off the high ceilings and wood-paneled walls. 400 seats arranged in ascending rows. 200 future executives, hedge fund managers, and corporate strategists filling those seats. One target being singled out in front of everyone. You, I said, stand up. The command came again, more forceful this time. The young man in the gray hoodie rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He stood at his full height, shoulders relaxed, face completely neutral. There was no defiance in his posture, but there was no submission either. Name, Hartwell demanded, crossing his arms across his chest. Isaiah Parker. The response was quiet but clear, carrying across the lecture hall despite the low volume. Professor Hartwell smiled then, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had never been punished for anything in his entire life. The smile of someone who had built a career on being right, on being powerful, on being protected by systems that rewarded people exactly like him. Mr. Parker, he said, turning slightly to address the entire class while keeping Isaiah in his peripheral vision. This is an advanced finance and quantitative strategy seminar. This is not a charity program. This is not a rehabilitation initiative. This is not a diversity experiment designed to make our university look more inclusive in glossy brochures. Soft laughter rippled through the room like a wave. It was safe laughter, the kind students offered when a professor with power made a joke that wasn't really a joke at all. Nobody wanted to be next. Nobody wanted to be noticed for the wrong reasons. Hartwell adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate slowness. They were gold, subtle, understated, but unmistakably expensive. The kind of detail that separated the elite from everyone else. Tell me, Mr. Parker, he continued, his voice dripping with false curiosity, are you here because of merit, or because someone in the administration upstairs needed a photo opportunity for the diversity section of our university brochure? The laughter came again, a little louder this time. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but most remained silent, eyes fixed forward or down at their laptops. Isaiah Parker said nothing in response. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, expression completely unreadable. Good, Hartwell thought to himself. Silence always meant surrender. Silence meant he had won. Silence meant this kid knew his place. What Professor Richard Hartwell didn't know, what absolutely no one in that lecture hall knew, not a single one of the 200 students or the teaching assistants seated near the front, was that Isaiah Parker already owned more wealth than everyone in that room combined. more money than Hartwell had earned in his entire distinguished career, more assets than the children of senators and CEOs sitting in the premium front row seats, more power than the university itself could imagine. And by the end of the week, Isaiah Parker would own Richard Hartwell's entire world. The education of invisibility. Isaiah Parker had learned early in life that visibility was expensive. When he was just 13 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in their modest apartment in Detroit, Michigan, his mother had told him a truth that most people never hear in their entire lives. "Never let powerful men know everything you are," she had said, her voice steady and serious in a way that made young Isaiah pay attention. "Especially when they think they're better than you, especially when they've already decided what you're worth before you even open your mouth." Her words were shaped by experience, bitter, hard-earned experience. So Isaiah learned to disappear. He learned to make himself small, unremarkable, forgettable. He wore cheap clothes purchased from discount stores and thrift shops, plain t-shirts, generic jeans, nothing with logos or brand names that might draw attention or questions. He asked no questions in class, even when he knew the answers, especially when he knew the answers better than the people teaching. He earned unremarkable grades throughout high school and into college. A solid B+ average at Whitmore University's elite School of Business and Economics, located in the heart of Boston, Massachusetts. Invisible, non-threatening, completely and utterly safe. No one asked why he never took notes during lectures. No one questioned why he never joined study groups or participated in group projects, unless absolutely required. No one wondered how a supposed scholarship student paid full tuition in cash, semester after semester, with no student loans and no financial aid applications. They saw exactly what they wanted to see. A quiet black kid from Detroit who probably didn't belong at a school like Whitmore, but who was smart enough to keep his head down and not cause trouble. Someone who would graduate, disappear into middle management somewhere, and be forgotten. They had no idea who he really was. The professor's game. Professor Richard Hartwell absolutely loved moments like this. 25 years teaching at Whitmore University in Boston. Full tenure with complete academic freedom. Six-figure consulting contracts with major financial institutions in New York and Chicago. Board seats at 3 different companies. Regular appearances on financial news networks. He was a man who taught the future billionaires of America exactly how power really worked in the real world. Not the sanitized version found in textbooks, but the ruthless, unforgiving reality of high finance. "Today," Hartwell announced, turning toward the massive digital board behind him that covered nearly the entire wall, "we're going to separate the students with genuine potential from the pretenders who are simply wasting everyone's time." He pulled up a financial model using the touch screen. This wasn't some simplified classroom exercise designed for undergraduate students. This was a real-world acquisition scenario so complex and layered that it had been used internally at elite hedge funds based in Manhattan and private equity firms operating out of San Francisco. "Anyone who successfully solves this valuation problem," Hartwell declared, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "will earn an automatic A for the entire semester. No additional exams, no final paper, just this one problem." Excited whispers erupted throughout the lecture hall. Students leaned toward each other, exchanging glances, calculating whether the risk was worth the potential reward. "However," Hartwell added, raising one finger for emphasis and waiting for complete silence before continuing, "anyone who attempts this problem and fails will lose a full-letter grade from their final semester score, immediately and permanently." The whispers died instantly. The risk was enormous. For students already struggling to maintain their GPAs, Gambling on a single problem could destroy their academic standing. Hartwell scanned the room slowly, his eyes moving from row to row, reading faces, enjoying the tension he had created. Then he stopped. Back row. Gray hoodie. Isaiah Parker. Mr. Parker, he said, his voice suddenly gentle, almost kind in a way that somehow made it more menacing. Why don't you come on down here to the front? Isaiah stood without hesitation. Every single eye in the lecture hall followed him as he made his way down the steep stairs between the tiered seating. 400 students watching a nobody walk toward what everyone assumed would be his complete and total humiliation. Hartwell leaned closer as Isaiah reached the front of the room, moving near enough that only Isaiah could hear his next words. Between us, Hartwell whispered, his breath smelling of coffee and arrogance, you won't last even a minute. You'll embarrass yourself, withdraw from my class, and hopefully reconsider whether you actually belong at an institution like Whitmore. Isaiah met his eyes directly. There was no anger in his expression, no fear, no nervousness, just absolute unshakable calm. Professor Hartwell stepped back and activated the digital timer on the screen. Begin. The problem nobody should solve. The financial model appeared on the massive screen in its full, overwhelming complexity. Multi-layered debt structures spanning 5 different entities. Offshore holdings registered in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. Regulatory compliance traps hidden in the footnotes. Hidden liabilities buried 3 organizational levels deep. Cross-border tax implications involving transactions between entities in Texas, New York, and Nevada. To most people, even most finance professionals, it looked completely impossible. To Isaiah Parker, it looked remarkably familiar. He had seen this exact structure before. Not in a textbook or academic journal. Not in a case study or simulation. But in an actual private boardroom in Chicago when he was just 16 years old, sitting quietly in the corner while adults argued about money and strategy. A man had been standing across a glass conference table, pointing at financial projections that were nearly identical to the ones now displayed on the screen. A man with silver hair and tired eyes, who had looked exhausted but determined. A man who had said, his voice cutting through the argument, if they don't see this critical flaw in the structure, then they deserve to lose absolutely everything they're risking. Isaiah smiled slightly at the memory, and he started solving the problem. The impossible made simple. The atmosphere in the lecture hall changed dramatically. At first, students watched out of simple curiosity, wanting to see how quickly the professor's target would fail and be humiliated. Then confusion began to spread through the room as Isaiah's hands moved across the digital interface. Then complete and utter silence descended. Isaiah wasn't guessing. He wasn't hesitating or second-guessing himself. He wasn't making random calculations, hoping something would work. He was systematically dismantling the problem, clean, surgical, absolutely ruthless in his efficiency. He restructured the acquisition framework, moving assets between entities. He neutralized the regulatory risk by changing the jurisdiction of 2 key transactions. He exposed a hidden asset that even Professor Hartwell himself had somehow missed when creating the problem. A tax credit worth millions that could be harvested through proper restructuring. Professor Hartwell's confident smile vanished completely. He stepped closer to the screen, his face showing confusion for the first time. That assumption you just made is fundamentally wrong, Hartwell snapped, his voice losing its careful control. Isaiah didn't even look at him. His focus remained completely on the problem in front of him. Check line 47 in your supporting documentation, Isaiah said calmly, his voice steady and professional. Your own footnote directly contradicts the assumption you're claiming I violated." Professor Hartwell froze mid-sentence. He grabbed his tablet and pulled up the documentation. He checked line 47. Isaiah was absolutely correct. The footnote was right there, clear as day, contradicting what Hartwell had just claimed. 90 seconds passed on the timer. Then Isaiah stepped back from the screen. "Done." The timer read 1:43. 1 minute and 43 seconds. The lecture hall didn't seem to breathe. The silence was so complete you could hear the ventilation system humming in the background. Professor Hartwell stared at the screen, his face pale. He ran the numbers again, using his own tablet. And again. And a third time, certain there had to be an error somewhere. The solution worked. Perfectly. Every calculation balanced, every regulatory requirement satisfied, every risk mitigated. It was flawless. Hartwell swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "That's not possible. No student should be able to solve that in under 2 minutes. "It is possible," Isaiah said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent room. "You just never considered that someone like me could actually do it." A few students near the front began to clap. Then more joined in. Within seconds, half the lecture hall was applauding. Professor Hartwell slammed his hand down on the podium. "Enough." The room went immediately quiet, the applause dying as quickly as it had started. He turned to face Isaiah directly, his eyes hard and cold. "Where did you learn to do this?" The question was sharp, accusatory. Isaiah paused for just a moment. Then he said the truth. "My father taught me." The color drained completely from Hartwell's face. His expression shifted from anger to something else, recognition, perhaps, or fear. "What did you just say?" "My father taught me this," Isaiah repeated, his voice stronger now, clearer. "He taught me everything about financial structure and corporate strategy, years before you stole his work and ruined his life." The room was dismissed early. Students flooded out of the lecture hall, phones already buzzing with text messages and social media posts about what they had just witnessed. Isaiah remained standing at the front. Professor Hartwell methodically closed the doors after the last student left, sealing them inside the now empty auditorium. "You have absolutely no idea what you're playing with, Mr. Parker," Hartwell said quietly, his voice low and threatening. "You have no concept of the forces you're attempting to challenge." For the first time since walking into the classroom, Isaiah smiled. A real smile. "Actually, Professor Hartwell, I know exactly what I'm doing." The email arrived in Isaiah's inbox the next morning at 6:47 a.m. Subject: Formal Academic Integrity Violation Notice. Professor Hartwell had filed official paperwork, accusing Isaiah of multiple serious violations. Cheating by pre-accessing proprietary examination material. Academic fraud. Unauthorized collaboration. Violation of the university's honor code. The recommended punishment: immediate expulsion from Whitmore University. Additional consequences: permanent notation on academic transcripts that would prevent transfer to any other reputable institution, effectively blacklisting him from higher education. Complete career death before his career had even begun. Professor Hartwell expected panic when Isaiah received the notice. What he received instead was complete silence. No frantic emails. No desperate phone calls. No appeals or begging for reconsideration. Nothing. Because while Professor Hartwell was carefully filing paperwork and building his case in Boston, Isaiah Parker was making entirely different kinds of phone calls. To corporate lawyers in Manhattan. To forensic auditors in Chicago. To financial investigators in Washington, D.C. to people who didn't answer to university professors or academic committees, people who answered to money, power, and legal authority. By Friday afternoon, just 4 days after the lecture hall incident, Whitmore University's Board of Trustees received an official legal notice. A controlling interest in the university's $8 billion endowment fund had changed hands. Quietly, legally, permanently. The new majority stakeholder had very specific concerns about how the endowment had been managed over the past 2 decades. The emergency Board of Trustees meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. Professor Richard Hartwell was summoned from his office in the economics building to the administration tower in the center of campus. He walked into the mahogany-paneled boardroom absolutely confident that he was being called to provide testimony against the student who had somehow hacked or stolen the examination materials. He walked out of that same boardroom 12 minutes later completely unemployed, because Isaiah Parker stood at the head of the conference table. The gray hoodie was gone. In its place, an impeccably tailored charcoal suit from a Savile Row tailor in London. No tie, he didn't need the formality. No need to prove anything to anyone anymore. "My father," Isaiah said calmly, his voice filling the silent boardroom, designed the entire investment framework that made Whitmore University's endowment fund profitable throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. He created the strategy that turned a modest $200 million fund into what eventually became an $8 billion endowment. Professor Hartwell stiffened in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. "You stole his work," Isaiah continued, his voice never rising but carrying absolute authority. "You systematically erased his name from every document, every report, every publication. You destroyed his professional reputation by spreading rumors about impropriety and mismanagement. And when he lost everything, his position, his savings, his health, you called it maintaining academic standards." Isaiah slid a thick folder across the polished conference table. It landed directly in front of Hartwell with a soft thud. Inside, original contracts with signatures and dates. Email correspondence going back 20 years. Financial records showing payments and authorship. Testimony from witnesses who had been too afraid to speak before. Absolute proof of systematic theft of intellectual property. "My father died 5 years ago in Detroit, Michigan," Isaiah said, his voice finally showing emotion, controlled, focused anger. "He died thinking he had failed, thinking his life's work had been worthless, thinking he had let his family down." Isaiah leaned forward, placing both hands on the conference table. "You lived rich for 2 decades, thinking no one would ever connect the dots, thinking no one would ever care enough to investigate, thinking you were protected by institutional power and academic politics." He paused. "I connected every single dot." Professor Hartwell opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to threaten legal action. Isaiah raised one finger. The gesture was small, but commanded absolute silence. "I'm not here for revenge, Professor Hartwell," he said clearly. "Revenge would be emotional, impulsive, and ultimately unsatisfying. I'm here for correction. I'm here to restore accuracy to the historical record and ensure justice is served appropriately." Within 72 hours, Professor Richard Hartwell was removed from every corporate board position he held. Every professional license and certification was either revoked or suspended pending investigation. Every academic journal that had published his work opened formal inquiries into potential plagiarism and academic misconduct. His carefully constructed legacy collapsed in near-total silence. Just like Isaiah's father's reputation had collapsed 2 decades earlier. The difference was that Isaiah's father had been innocent. 2 weeks later, Isaiah Parker returned to the same lecture hall. Same back row where invisible people sat. Same seat in the corner, but living in a completely different reality than when he had first walked in. A student sitting nearby whispered to her friend, "That's him. That's the guy who took down Hartwell." Isaiah didn't respond or acknowledge the comment. Real power didn't need announcements or validation. Real power simply existed. Before sitting down, Isaiah walked to the front of the empty lecture hall and placed something on the podium where professors stood. A formal legal document establishing a new scholarship endowment. Fully funded. Permanent. Specifically designed for students from underrepresented backgrounds studying finance and economics. The endowment was established in his father's name. Beside the document, he left a simple note written in clean handwriting. Numbers don't lie. People do. Isaiah returned to his seat in the back row and waited for class to begin. The seat where nobody important ever looked. Except now, everyone was looking.